Year 10 and 11, welcome to your comparison of exposure and the charge of the Light Brigade in preparation for your AQA English Literature Poetry exam. Because it's a comparative essay, I do always like to start with just a quick revision of connectives. So the connectives at the top there in the dark colour are to use if the poems are different, and the connectives in red there are to use if the poems are similar. So you've got whereas, on the other hand, however, in contrast, unlike and alternatively. And if anything is similar about the poems, then we might use similarly, likewise, equally, as with, and in the same way. And just some variation of the word shows. There's nothing wrong with using the word shows at all, but just a variation so we don't use it too much. You've got suggests, implies, outlines, highlights, describes, communicates, connotes, emphasises, reveals, displays, establishes, portrays, represents, illustrates, informs, means, conveys, and symbolises. A potential essay format might look like the following, but it depends how your teacher has told you to answer this question. This is just a suggestion. You might put your introduction, which answers the question, detailed structure in exposure, compare it to structure in the charge of the Light Brigade, then move to language in exposure, compare that to language in the charge of the Light Brigade, and if you have time, finish with your conclusion. So if we begin with structure in the poems, exposure is on the left, the charge of the Light Brigade is on the right. In exposure, we've got half rhyme, which adds a sombre tone under the surface of the poem, and it adds a discord which challenges our expectations. Because remember, in exposure, the strange or bizarre thing is that the weather is killing the soldiers, and underneath the poem, via the half rhyme, like silent and salient, we realise that our expectations are challenged because we don't expect the men to be dying because of the weather. We also have the regular stanzas, and the regular stanzas highlight the monotony of life in the trenches, but they also subtly outline the irony in the phrase, nothing happens. And the massive irony in exposure is that the men don't realise they're dying. And therein, again, tying to my first bullet point, lies this sombre tone whereby we realise they are dying, but they don't. As the poem progresses as well, the men's suffering worsens, which again, as a reader, we realise. And by the final stanza, the soldiers are on the verge of death, and we see that stanzas 5, 6 and 7 end with, is it that we are dying? We turn back to our dying, for the love of God seems dying. And we can see that the suffering of what was the wind and the snow and the rain is now, they have given in to death. And therein lies a very sad moment within the poem. And to link to that, the poem shifts focus from the men themselves to the dreams that they have to their beliefs, and their beliefs are waning, and they realise actually that God isn't going to help them. And so by the end of the poem, the men, their dreams and their beliefs are all broken. The Light Brigade, there's a lot more in terms of structure. So we have the 6 numbered stanzas which vary in length. Now, each line is in diameter, which means it has 2 stressed syllables followed by 2 unstressed syllables, which makes the rhythm dactylic. That means it is a falling rhythm. Now, the use of a falling rhythm is appropriate in this poem because it is about the fall of this British brigade, the Light Brigade, and it symbolises death. You might need to pause the video there to ensure you get that down. I've put diameter and dactylic in bold. Keywords, make sure you get them spelled correctly as well. Okay, so 2 stressed syllables followed by 2 unstressed syllables, a falling rhythm, which links to the falling of the soldiers. The charge of the Light Brigade also uses the volta. A volta, remember, is a change in tone within a poem. And the volta in the charge of the Light Brigade is, but not the 600. That is when we realise that the men are dying and that there isn't 600 left anymore. If dimeter and dactylic is too difficult, I've made it slightly simpler by adding 2 heavy beats followed by 2 light beats to represent the galloping horses. We have the 6 stanzas, which could be a memorial for the 600 soldiers. We have the rigid structure, which is similar to exposure, and it highlights this strict formation that the military employ. You can't defy the rules or the laws of the military. Even when a mistake has been made in this poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, they are following orders that are misinformed. We have the occasional use of the rhyming couplet. Again, it's this incessant galloping, this didn't rhythm. It could also represent the 2 sides in the battle, Britain versus Russia, and it also, much like exposure with its half rhyme, alludes to the inevitability of death. The Charge of the Light Brigade is also a ballad, and it is a story that has a tragic ending. It cleverly uses refrain. Refrain is the repetition of the same verse or the same phrase throughout a poem. We get that a few times. Most notably, Rode the 600 is the refrain, and that emphasises that there's only 600 men, and 600 men is not a lot in a battle, and it reiterates how outnumbered we were. And your last structural point for the Light Brigade is that it begins in medias res, and in medias res means in the middle of something. And it begins with half a league, half a league. And as a reader, it's as if we are thrown full pelt into a battle. It's almost the mimicking of a war zone itself. We feel like we are thrown in, probably not best prepared, and it's fast and it's frantic. Now, in an essay when we are under strict time restraint, select the information you know you're going to remember and can analyse well. Because if we look there's quite a lot to say about the Charge of the Light Brigade. I think you need the falling rhythm. Hopefully you can remember dimeter and dactylic, volta, and refrain. I think those 3 really sell to the examiner that you know poetic terminology and you can explain its use. We shall move to language in the poems now. Same format as before, exposure is on the left, the Light Brigade is on the right, and I haven't done every single language device, I've just pointed out some main ones. So, in exposure we get the personification of iced east winds that knife us, and mad gusts tugging on the wire, and flakes with lingering stealth come feeling for our faces, and his frost will fasten on this mud and us. Personification is one of the key devices in exposure, because as I said earlier, we are being told and we are witnessing the power of nature and the weather is killing the men. So by personifying the weather as winds that knife, we realise its danger. We realise that when the wind hits these vulnerable bodies in the trenches, that it hurts, that it is cold, it is penetrating the men, it is hurting them and killing them. Mad gusts tugging on the wire, it's an irritant. It's, that word tugging, it won't leave them alone. It's constantly attacking them, probably more so and more frequently and more often than the enemy. Flakes with lingering stealth come feeling for our faces. Again, massive. piece of personification there. And the idea here, and the biggest word there, is stealth. So the snow is stealth and the cold is stealth because, as I said earlier, and it is massive, they don't initially realise the cold is killing them. And that's why it's stealth. And again, it's almost like the enemy, as if they haven't seen the enemy sneaking up on them. Feeling for our faces. Look at the alliteration of the F there. It's prolonged pain, isn't it? And we've all been outside in the cold, and when it hits your face, it is horrible. And then again, look at that massive piece of personification with a capital H. His frost will fasten on this mud and us. And again, you've got the alliteration of the F, and it does make it more memorable. His frost will fasten, and it does sound like you can't get rid of it. And his, with a capital H, is personification, but also, is it a reference to God? Is it a reference to the devil? Is it death himself? And if something is fastened on, again, it's this implication that we can't get rid of it. So you can't do this poem, you can't write about this poem without personification, guys. Next bullet point, the east winds are merciless and icy, and we get sibilants in a lot of S sounds. So again, iced, east, winds, knife us, and it sounds hard. And we've got the consonants of the D and the T, iced, east, winds, and it creates this bitter tone, a bitter temperature. The fact that the men are dying because of the elements. As I say, the gusts of wind are personified as something mad, tugging, suggesting it's catching on. And the wind is also a human because it's indifferent. We get the word nonchalance. So in the face of all this suffering, the wind and nature doesn't care. It's indifferent. And then usually when we get this line about dawn in exposure, please have the poem in front of you when you're doing your revision. Usually the coming of dawn is a symbol of hope and light. But here in this poem we are told that dawn brings with it poignant misery. So when the day arrives, then the new day arrives, the men are miserable because they are stuck in this monotonous cycle indicated by the regular stanzas. They're stuck in the trench. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to do but await death. And then we get dawn again, personified as a weary female war commander, massing her melancholy army. And again, look at that alliteration of the M, massing her melancholy army. And it creates a sense of oppression. And massing her army sounds as if there's a huge number, as if Wilfred Owen and his troops can't defend themselves against it. I've got more to say about exposure on the next slide, but just to keep it comparative, we'll look at some of the language devices in the Light Brigade. So down the right, again, I've just outlined some of the main things. We've got repetition of half a league, and don't forget, that is in media res on the first line. The use of this repeated phrase emphasises the incessant gunfire and the commands of the people in charge. Half a league, onward, forward the Light Brigade. And the men can't escape. They can't escape following orders, nor can they escape the Russian gunfire. Metaphor Valley of Death suggests obviously that the men are running to die and they can't afford death. I mentioned the inevitability of death when we talked about the rhyme scheme. And death has got a capital D, so it's personified as something more dangerous. The speech of forward the Light Brigade does make it sound realistic. And remember, this is one of the first wars that was ever reported by an eyewitness account in a newspaper, so it gives it this realistic tone, and as a reader it's almost as if we are there first hand receiving the orders, and it's intimidating, isn't it? Forward the Light Brigade, half a league onward. There's emotive language all the way through this poem, naturally, because of the fact that men are sacrificing their lives. So all the way through, we've got things like death and die and hero and honour. And it does present these men and these troops as people to be remembered, because they've given up their life when they knew they were going to lose, actually. And they weren't just going to lose, they were going to be slaughtered. Now, there's a mistake, as it says in the word blundered. There is a mistake in the orders, and the men know they still have to fight. And that is why the rhetorical question, was there a man dismayed, is so powerful. Because the men follow orders and complete their duties regardless. And that there is where your bravery lies. Most of us today, if we knew we were totally outnumbered, would not run into a battle. And actually, most of us wouldn't run into battle if we weren't outnumbered. So we see the bravery of the men, and we have a respect, and there's a tone of respect in this poem, and there's a tone of honour. Repetition of there's not to make reply, there's but to do and die. As I say, follow orders. You follow orders, you do not answer back, you don't question. And even knowing you're outnumbered, you fight for your country and you fight for your comrades. And the repetition of cannon, and that's massive, isn't it? Cannon to the left of them, cannon to the right of them, cannon in front of them. Arguably the most memorable section of the poem. And the repetition of cannon, and it's a triple, one after the other, is the fact that they're trapped. Not only are they trapped in this valley, but they are trapped by the gunfire of the Russians, and they can't escape. And the cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them reminds us of that. I'm going to move to your next slide, which has, again, more language devices on from both poems. So we'll start with exposure on the left again. So some more language devices we might analyse in an essay are the following. The clouds are presented as an army, like German tanks, grey, stormy, and lined up in rank upon shivering rank, ready to attack. So again, all the way through, we realise that actually the men's problem is not essentially the Germans, but actually the weather. And the title exposure has a few different meanings. They are exposed to the Germans, they are exposed to the weather, they are exposed to mental frailties. Because remember, a lot of men would leave war with post-traumatic stress disorder. So there's the title refers to a few things here. The snow appears to make conscious decisions about where it's going to settle and when it's going to attack. And that's in the line flock, pause and renew. And that there is unsettling and it's dangerous, and it is a reference to the power of nature again, that the snow can make decisions. It can pause, it can decide to attack, it can flock together. And we know through the personification I mentioned on the other slide that it feels the men's faces and kills them via the cold. I've outlined some more sibilants with hard consonants just to prove a point and to show you the desolate atmosphere that's created. You've got words like lasts, soaks, clouds, sag, stormy, massing, east, attacks, ranks, shivering, sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. So your sibilants and your hard consonants represent not only this horrific atmosphere, it represents the clinging on of the weather to their men when it fastens on them. It represents the bullets that are flying towards the men and that they can't avoid and can't stop. And Wilfred Owen's sound imagery here is petrifying, and it adds to that sombre tone I mentioned earlier. It's very harsh. And alongside that, we've got assonance as well. And what the assonance does actually is it makes the painful experience drawn out. It makes it more prolonged if possible. And we get grow, only, no, soaks, slowly, ghosts, home. And these dragged out long assonant sounds of your vowels represent the struggle that the soldiers have, and that they can't comprehend the outside world, and they forget the outside world because of the troubles that they now have. And as I say, it just makes the experience more painful, and it draws it out for us as a reader, let alone these poor men. I've added another metaphor on the bottom there of all their eyes are ice, because that's a straightforward metaphor to analyse. Not only are they dead, or some of them dead, obviously, and are lying there dead off the weather, but some of them are ice in terms of emotionless, cold, because of what they've witnessed, because of what they've experienced, because they've probably had to kill someone. And don't forget, exposure also uses some very important rhetorical questions, like, is it that we are dying? And that rhetorical question is huge. If you wanted a Volta in this poem, it is probably there when they acknowledge the fact that they're going to die. And I can't think of anything more harrowing than accepting your death is about to happen. So rhetorical questions in this poem are particularly disturbing because it is the acceptance of one's death. Okay, the charge of the Light Brigade then, in a similar fashion, uses alliteration and sibilance, stormed out with shot and shell. And in this poem, it's the incessant gunfire and the fact that they can't avoid it, and it's coming from all sides. And when you link that to the cannon to the left of them, cannon to the right of them, half a league onward, we realise just how trapped the men are. The metaphor or personification, jaws of death, by giving death jaws, it becomes more deadly and dangerous. And the idea that if they are heading into a mouth, if a mouth closes, you can't get out. So again, it's this illusion that they will be stuck. And jaws of death, I think sounds more deadly than the valley of death, because valley to me sounds quite open, whereas jaws is something a little bit more frightening and a little bit more deadly. As I mentioned in structure, you've got your Volta, then they rode back, but not the 600. There's your change in tone in the charge of the Light Brigade, because it is the acknowledgement that the men who return aren't 600 anymore, but there's quite a lot of them dead. A lot of them will be injured as well. So when they do return, there's a lot of them missing. The canon line is repeated again in the poem, so that's in 2 stanzas, just to reiterate that they can't escape. And I suppose it does emphasise the bravery of these men, that they ran into a trap. And towards the end of this poem, we get the theme of bravery and the word hero and the word honour and the word noble, and it is the idea that these men should be remembered, which we get in the rhetorical question, when can their glory fade? Will people remember them? And the irony here, I suppose, is that we do remember them, because not only is this a hugely famous poem, but a lot of people remember it. And if you say it to people in the public, like my dad, for instance, I'm doing the charge of the Light Brigade, he will say cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, and it is synonymous with something very famous. And it is a moment in history, and it is a moment in history because of the bravery, but also because it was a mistake made. So we do end the poem in a positive manner, in the sense that the men are honoured and the men are remembered. And I don't think exposure ends in that way. I think exposure ends in a harrowing, awful way, whereby as a reader we are educated a little bit more about World War One and the terrible experience of life in the trench. Okay. I hope this video was useful. It was a request just to get a comparison of exposure and the charge of the Light Brigade. If you do need any more of my videos, just type Stacey Reay into YouTube. Stacey, and Reay is Reay. All my videos are there. It's probably a good idea to watch Exposure and the Charge of the Light Brigade separately, so you get all the notes. And good luck in your AQA English Literature poetry exam.